There are miracles of Jesus that almost everyone remembers. He walked on water. He multiplied the loaves. He raised Lazarus from the dead. But the Gospels contain other miracles. Miracles that are rarely discussed. Some happened in forgotten villages. Some involved people whose names were never recorded. And some lasted only moments. Yet each one revealed something extraordinary about the man at the center of the story. One miracle happened in a region where many Jews would never have expected the Messiah to appear. Another involved a blind man whose healing happened in two distinct moments. Another transformed a simple Sabbath dispute into a confrontation with the most powerful religious leaders in Israel. 10 people were healed, but only one came back. And then there was a miracle so unusual that it involved a fish, a coin, and a question about the temple tax. These are not simply forgotten stories. They are clues. Clues that reveal how Jesus treated the suffering, how he confronted religious authority, how he responded to faith, and ultimately, who he claimed to be. For nearly 2,000 years, these moments have remained inside the pages of the Gospels. But when we look at them closely, their meaning becomes impossible to ignore. These are the forgotten miracles of Jesus, and their story is about to begin. The road into Decapolis led Jesus far beyond the familiar crowds of Galilee. This was not Jerusalem. This was not the heart of Jewish religious life. Decapolis was a region of cities influenced heavily by Greek and Roman culture, a place where Jewish and Gentile communities lived alongside one another. And it was here, away from the great crowds that followed Jesus, that a remarkable encounter took place. A man was brought before him. He could not hear, and because of his condition, his speech was severely impaired. For years, the world around him had been filled with sounds he could not hear. Conversations passed around him. Children laughed. People called his name. The sounds of daily life continued, but he could not participate in them as others did. His inability to hear had also affected his ability to speak clearly. He lived with a barrier that separated him from the ordinary communication of the people around him. Then someone brought him to Jesus. They did not ask Jesus for a public demonstration. They simply asked him to place his hand upon the man. Jesus looked at him, and instead of performing the miracle before the entire crowd, he did something unexpected. He took the man away from the crowd, away from the noise, away from the people who had gathered around. For a moment, it was simply Jesus and the man. Jesus then used physical gestures to communicate what was about to happen. He placed his fingers upon the man's ears. Then he touched the man's tongue, and he looked toward heaven. The moment was deeply personal. There was no spectacle, no stage, no attempt to impress the crowd. Jesus was communicating with someone who could not hear ordinary words. Then he sighed and spoke a single command, Ephphatha, a word from the Aramaic language of the region. It meant, be opened, and immediately the man's ears were opened. The barrier that had separated him from the world around him was gone. But something else happened as well. The restriction upon his speech was removed. He began to speak clearly. For the first time, sounds that had once been inaccessible to him became part of his world. Imagine that moment. The voices of the people around him, the movement of the crowd, the sounds of the surrounding countryside. Perhaps even his own voice, now heard for the first time. Those who witnessed what happened were astonished. They had brought Jesus a man with a condition that had shaped his entire life. And Jesus had restored what the man had lost. But the story did not end with the miracle itself. Mark records something remarkable about the reaction of the people. The more Jesus instructed them not to spread the news, the more they continued proclaiming it. They were overwhelmed by what they had witnessed, and their conclusion was simple. He has done everything well. They had seen the deaf hear. They had seen the man who struggled to speak communicate clearly. But there was something deeper taking place. This miracle occurred in Decapolis, and that detail matters. Jesus was not performing this sign only among the religious center of Israel. He was moving through a region where Jewish and Gentile cultures met. The kingdom he proclaimed was beginning to reach beyond the boundaries people expected, and the miracle itself carried a powerful message. Jesus did not treat the man as a problem to be solved. He met him where he was. He communicated with him in a way he could understand. He took him away from the crowd, and then he restored him. The miracle was immediate, but the memory of it would continue. A man who had spent years unable to hear could now hear. A man whose speech had been restricted could now speak, and those who witnessed it could not stop talking about what they had seen. Yet this was only the beginning, because the Gospels contain another miracle that is even more unusual. A man who could not see was about to encounter Jesus, but his healing would not happen in a single moment. It would happen in stages, and what happened next in Bethsaida would become one of the most unusual miracles recorded in the ministry of Jesus. The story continues. Bethsaida was a small fishing town on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was a place Jesus knew well. He had walked through its streets. He had taught among its people. And yet, despite everything that had happened there, the town would later become associated with one of the strongest warnings Jesus ever gave to a community that had witnessed his works. But before that warning, something remarkable happened there. One day, Jesus and his disciples arrived in Bethsaida. As they entered the town, some people brought a blind man to him. They had heard what Jesus could do. They knew he had restored the sick. They had heard stories of people who had been suffering for years and suddenly walked away healed. So they brought this man to Jesus, and they asked him to touch him. The request was simple, but Jesus did something unexpected. He took the blind man by the hand, and he led him away from the village, away from the crowd, away from the people who had gathered around. Once again, Jesus chose a personal encounter rather than a public spectacle. The man could not see where they were going. He had to trust the person leading him. Step by step, Jesus guided him away from the familiar surroundings of Bethsaida. Then Jesus did something unusual. He touched the man's eyes and asked him a question. "Do you see anything?" The man opened his eyes. For the first time, there was light, but something was different. His vision had not yet become clear. He looked around and described what he could see. People appeared to him like trees walking around. He could see movement. He could distinguish shapes, but everything remained blurred. The miracle had begun, but it was not yet complete. And this is what makes this story so unusual. In the gospel accounts, Jesus' healings are often immediate. A disease disappears. A person rises. A blind man receives sight. But here, the healing happened in stages. Jesus placed his hands upon the man's eyes again. Then the man looked once more. This time, his sight was restored. His vision became clear. He could see everything distinctly. Imagine the moment. After years of darkness, the world suddenly appeared before him. The landscape, the faces, the movement of people, the light of the sky, the familiar streets of the town, everything he had previously known only through sound and touch, could now be seen, and Jesus had done it. But why did the healing happen in two stages? The gospel does not give us a direct explanation, and that is important. We should not invent an answer where Scripture remains silent. Instead, the story invites us to notice what actually happened. Jesus was completely capable of restoring the man's sight. The second touch brought complete clarity, and the man himself became a living testimony of the miracle. But there is another reason this story matters. Bethsaida was not just any town. It was one of the places where Jesus had performed many powerful works. The people had witnessed his ministry. They had seen evidence of his authority. Yet many still refused to respond with repentance. Later, Jesus would speak directly about Bethsaida and warn of the consequences of rejecting what its people had witnessed. The town had seen much, but seeing was not the same as believing. And that creates a striking connection with the blind man. One man entered the encounter unable to see and left with clear vision. But an entire community could witness the works of Jesus and still remain spiritually blind. The physical miracle therefore stands within a much larger story. Jesus was not simply restoring eyesight. His ministry repeatedly challenged people to recognize something beyond the miracle itself. Who was he? Why had he come? And what would people do with what they had seen? The blind man of Bethsaida received his sight, but the people around him were being confronted with another kind of blindness, a blindness that no human hand could heal. The story of Bethsaida therefore leaves us with an uncomfortable question. What is the value of seeing a miracle if we refuse to recognize what it reveals? The man who had been blind walked away seeing clearly. But the spiritual condition of the town remained unchanged, and that contrast would become part of Jesus' larger message. Because throughout his ministry, miracles were never merely displays of power. They were signs. Signs pointing beyond themselves. Signs demanding a response. And sometimes, the most important question was not whether someone could see the miracle. It was whether they could see who was standing before them. The blind man of Bethsaida had received his sight, but the journey through the lesser-known miracles of Jesus was only beginning. Because the next story would take us into a completely different setting. A synagogue, a man with a disabled hand, and a confrontation that would expose just how far some religious leaders were willing to go to protect their interpretation of the Sabbath. The next miracle would not simply restore a man's hand. It would challenge the religious establishment itself. The synagogue was filled with people. It was the Sabbath. For generations, the Jewish people had gathered on this day to worship God, hear the scriptures, and rest from their ordinary work. But on this particular Sabbath, the attention of the synagogue was not focused on the scriptures. It was focused on one man. A man stood among them whose hand was severely disabled. The Gospel of Mark describes it as a withered hand. Whatever had caused the condition, the result was visible. One hand could no longer function normally. For the man, this was more than a physical limitation. His disability would have affected ordinary tasks, working, carrying objects, using tools, providing for himself. Even simple movements that other people performed without thinking could have become difficult. And now, he stood in the synagogue with Jesus. But there was another group watching, the religious leaders. They had been observing Jesus closely, not because they wanted to learn from him, but because they were looking for a reason to accuse him. They knew Jesus had healed people before. They knew his compassion toward those who suffered. And they also knew that he had challenged their understanding of the Sabbath. So when they saw the man with the withered hand, they saw an opportunity. They watched Jesus carefully. Would he heal the man? Would he act on the Sabbath? The question was no longer simply about one man's hand. It had become a test, a trap. They wanted Jesus to choose between their interpretation of the law and the suffering person standing before him. Jesus knew what they were thinking, and instead of avoiding the confrontation, he brought the issue into the open. He told the man to stand up. The man stepped forward. The entire synagogue could see him. Then Jesus asked those watching a question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? No one answered. Silence filled the synagogue. The religious leaders had been prepared to accuse Jesus. But now they were being forced to confront the meaning of the very law they claimed to defend. Jesus looked around at them, and according to Mark's account, he was deeply grieved by the hardness of their hearts. The man with the disabled hand stood there waiting. He was not a theological argument. He was a human being, someone who had come into the synagogue carrying a physical burden. and Jesus called him forward. Then he gave him a simple command. "Stretch out your hand." The man obeyed. He extended the hand that had been disabled. And as he did, his hand was restored. The physical condition that had marked his life was gone. The man could move it again. What had been damaged was restored. What had been limited was made whole. And everyone in the synagogue had witnessed it. But the reaction was not what we might expect. There should have been celebration. There should have been gratitude. A man had just been healed. Yet the Pharisees did not celebrate. Instead, they began discussing what they could do against Jesus. The miracle had revealed something deeper than the man's physical condition. It had revealed the condition of their hearts. They were more concerned with defending their interpretation of the Sabbath than celebrating the restoration of a suffering man. And this is what makes this miracle so important. Jesus was not teaching that God's law was meaningless. He was revealing its true purpose. The Sabbath was not designed to prevent mercy. It was not created to make compassion illegal. God's commands were never meant to turn people away from those who were suffering. The man with the withered hand became the center of a confrontation between mercy and hardened religion. And Jesus made his position clear. Doing good was not a violation of God's purpose. Helping someone in need was not an offense against God. Compassion was not the enemy of holiness. It was part of it. The miracle therefore accomplished something far greater than the restoration of one hand. It exposed the difference between knowing the law and understanding the heart behind it. The religious leaders had scripture. They had traditions. They had authority. But standing before them was a man whose life had just been transformed. And Jesus had done it openly, on the Sabbath, in front of everyone. There was no way to deny what had happened. The man's hand had been restored, but the hearts of those who opposed Jesus had become even harder. And that contrast appears again and again throughout the gospel story. Some people came to Jesus carrying suffering and left transformed. Others came carrying certainty and refused to change. The miracle of the withered hand therefore leaves us with a question that reaches far beyond that ancient synagogue. What happens when religious rules become more important than the people they were meant to serve? Jesus' answer was demonstrated before everyone that day. A suffering man mattered. His restoration mattered. And mercy could never be treated as an enemy of God. But the next miracle would reveal another dimension of Jesus' ministry. This time, the problem would not be one person's hand. It would be 10 people suffering from a disease that had separated them from their families, their communities, and ordinary life. 10 would cry out for mercy. 10 would receive healing, but only one would return. And what that one man did next would reveal something about gratitude, faith, and the unexpected people who recognized Jesus for who he truly was. There were 10 men standing at a distance. They could not come any closer, not because they did not want to, but because the disease they carried had separated them from almost everyone they loved. In the world of first-century Judea, leprosy was not simply a medical condition. It could mean isolation. A person suffering from a serious skin disease could be forced to live outside the community, separated from family and ordinary society. They could not simply walk into a village. They could not approach people normally. And when someone passed nearby, they were expected to make their condition known. Their disease had become part of their identity. Their lives had been interrupted. Their homes were behind them. Their families were distant, and their future was uncertain. Then one day, Jesus was traveling along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he approached a village, 10 men saw him. They recognized who he was. But they remained at a distance. They could not approach him like everyone else. So they raised their voices and cried out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." It was not a complicated request. They did not ask for wealth. They did not ask for recognition. They asked for mercy. Jesus saw them, and instead of immediately touching them, he gave them an instruction. "Go, show yourselves to the priests." That command would have been familiar to anyone who knew the law of Moses. The priests had an important role in determining whether someone with a serious skin disease was clean and could return to the community. But there was something unusual about Jesus' command. The men had not yet visibly received their healing. They were being told to go before they could see the result. So they began walking. 10 men, 10 journeys, 10 acts of obedience, and somewhere along the way, something happened. Their condition changed. The disease that had separated them from society was gone. They had been healed. Imagine the realization. A man looks at his hands. Another touches his own face. Another looks toward the person walking beside him. They begin to understand. They were clean. They could return. They could go home. They could see their families again. They could re-enter the community. The life they had lost was suddenly within reach. 10 men had received exactly what they had asked Jesus for. But then, something unexpected happened. One of them stopped. He turned around. He did not continue toward the priests. He did not continue toward his old life. He turned back toward Jesus. And the gospel tells us something else about this man. He was a Samaritan. That detail would have mattered enormously to the people listening to the story. Jews and Samaritans had a long history of hostility and division. They were separated by religious, cultural, and political differences. Yet among the 10 men, it was the Samaritan who returned. He came back praising God with a loud voice. He fell at Jesus' feet, and he thanked him. 10 had received healing, but only one returned to the source of his healing. Jesus then asked a question. Were not 10 cleansed? There were 10. Jesus knew that. Everyone could count them. But only one had returned. Then came another question. Where are the 9? The question hangs over the story. Where were they? They had received their miracle. They had been restored. But they had continued on their way. Only one had stopped to give thanks. And then Jesus looked at the man who had returned. He told him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." The story contains a detail that is easy to overlook. All 10 were healed, but only one returned to Jesus. The physical blessing was given to all of them, yet the response was different. And that distinction is at the heart of the story. The miracle was not only about skin being restored, it was about recognition. The Samaritan recognized what had happened. He understood that his healing demanded a response. So he returned. He praised God. He fell before Jesus. And he gave thanks. The man who had once been forced to stand at a distance was now lying at the feet of Jesus. The distance had disappeared. The isolation had ended. The man who had been excluded from society had returned to the presence of the one who had restored him. And perhaps the most surprising part of the story is that the person who recognized the significance of the miracle was the man many Jews would have considered an outsider, the Samaritan, the person least expected to become the example. Yet Jesus placed him at the center of the story. This was consistent with something Jesus repeatedly demonstrated throughout his ministry. God's work could not be confined to the boundaries people created. The kingdom of God was reaching people others had rejected. People who were sick, people who were isolated, people who were considered outsiders, people who were overlooked. And in this case, one of those outsiders became the only one who returned. The 10 lepers came to Jesus asking for mercy. They received it, but only one returned with gratitude. And that leaves a question that reaches far beyond the ancient road between Samaria and Galilee. How often do people ask God for help, receive what they desperately wanted, and then continue with their lives without looking back? The 9 received the miracle. The one returned to the miracle worker. And that difference is what Jesus wanted his listeners to notice. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not simply receiving what we asked for. It is recognizing who gave it to us. But there was another remarkable encounter in the ministry of Jesus. An event so unusual that it involved neither a crowd seeking healing, nor a person suffering from disease. Instead, Jesus would use an ordinary fish to provide something unexpectedly important. A coin, and the next miracle would reveal another side of his authority. Not over sickness, not over blindness, not over disease, but over an ordinary problem faced by ordinary people. A tax was due, and Peter was about to discover where the money would come from. Not every miracle in the ministry of Jesus involved a disease. Not every miracle happened before a crowd. And not every miracle ended with someone rising from a bed or walking away from a lifetime of suffering. One of the most unusual moments recorded in the Gospels began with something remarkably ordinary. A tax. Jesus and his disciples had arrived in Capernaum. There, the collectors of the temple tax approached Peter. They asked him a simple question: "Does your teacher pay the temple tax?" Peter answered yes. Then he returned to the house where Jesus was staying. But before Peter could explain what had happened, Jesus already knew what he had been asked. He asked Peter a question: "From whom do earthly kings collect taxes? From their own sons or from others?" Peter answered that they collected them from others. Jesus then made his point: the sons were exempt. The conversation was not simply about money. It revealed something about Jesus' identity. The temple was the house dedicated to the worship of God. And Jesus was making clear that he was not simply another ordinary worshiper arriving to pay a debt. Yet he chose not to create an unnecessary offense. Instead, he told Peter to go to the Sea of Galilee, and there, something extraordinary would happen. Jesus instructed him to cast a hook into the water. The first fish he caught would contain exactly what was needed: a coin, enough to pay the temple tax for both Jesus and Peter. Peter had been a fisherman for much of his life. He knew the Sea of Galilee. He knew how to work with nets. He understood the rhythms of the water. But this instruction was different. Jesus was not simply telling him where to fish, he was telling him what he would find. Peter went to the water. He prepared his fishing line. He cast the hook into the Sea of Galilee. The line disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the movement came. A fish took the bait. Peter pulled it from the water. And there, inside the fish, was the coin, the exact amount required. A completely ordinary object, obtained through an extraordinary instruction. And Peter now had what he needed to pay the tax. But why did Jesus choose such a strange method? The gospel does not give us every detail. It simply records what happened. And that restraint matters. We do not need to invent an elaborate explanation. The story itself is enough. Jesus knew exactly what Peter would find, and he provided what was necessary. There is also something deeply interesting about the way this miracle unfolded. Jesus did not simply hand Peter a coin. He involved him. Peter had to go to the water. He had to cast the hook. He had to wait. He had to pull in the fish, and then he discovered the provision waiting inside it. The fisherman was asked to trust the instruction before he could see the result. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout the ministry of Jesus. People were often asked to act before they understood what would happen next. A man was told to stretch out his hand. 10 lepers were told to go and show themselves to the priests. The blind man of Bethsaida was led away from the crowd. And now Peter was told to cast a hook into the sea. In each story, the command came first. The result came afterward. But there is another important detail. Jesus did not use this moment to avoid responsibility. He chose to pay the tax. He did not want his actions to become an unnecessary stumbling block. The coin found in the fish therefore became more than a strange story about money. It revealed a combination of authority and humility. Jesus demonstrated authority over circumstances. yet willingly submitted to what was required to avoid unnecessary offense. And Peter, the experienced fisherman, was once again learning that following Jesus meant trusting him even when the instruction seemed unusual. Imagine Peter returning from the water, the same man who had spent years fishing these waters, now carrying a coin that had been found exactly where Jesus said it would be. He had gone to the lake expecting to catch a fish. Instead, he returned with a reminder. Jesus knew what Peter needed before Peter could provide it himself. And that brings us to the final miracle in this collection. Because when we look back at all 5 stories, a pattern begins to emerge. The deaf man was restored. The blind man received sight. The man with the withered hand was made whole. 10 lepers were cleansed, and Peter found provision in an unexpected place. 5 very different situations, 5 very different needs, 5 different settings. But behind every story, there was the same Jesus. Jesus who entered places others avoided. Jesus who touched people others overlooked. Jesus who confronted religious hardness. Jesus who welcomed outsiders. Jesus who responded to desperate cries for mercy. And Jesus who provided even when the solution seemed impossible. These miracles may receive less attention than the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, or the raising of Lazarus. But perhaps that is exactly why they deserve another look. Because when we slow down, the details begin to speak. The deaf man teaches us about restoration. The blind man of Bethsaida reminds us that the Gospels sometimes describe healing in unexpected ways. The man with the withered hand reveals the priority of mercy over hardened legalism. The 10 lepers expose the difference between receiving a blessing and returning with gratitude. And the coin in the fish reveals a Messiah who possessed authority, yet chose humility. These were not random stories. They were moments preserved by the gospel writers because they revealed something about Jesus. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the miracle itself was never the entire story. The question was always, what would people do after encountering him? Some received healing. Some received provision. Some received a second chance. But every encounter demanded a response. And that is why these lesser-known miracles still matter. They do not simply tell us what Jesus did. They invite us to ask, who was Jesus? And why did these moments matter enough to be remembered? The answer becomes clearer when we place all 5 stories together. The man who could not hear, he heard. The man who could not see, he saw. The man whose hand was withered, he stretched it out. The 10 who cried for mercy, they were cleansed. And Peter, he cast a hook into the sea and found exactly what Jesus had promised. Different miracles, different people, different needs, but one central figure, Jesus of Nazareth. And these forgotten miracles may reveal more about him than we realize. The miracles were never merely about what Jesus could do. They were signs pointing to who he was. And the story of his power was only beginning. Every miracle of Jesus was a sign pointing to who he truly is. Which of these 5 stories did you need to hear today? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bible History Uncovered for the next chapter in this series.